Hi, I'm Tony Goldwyn. I am an actor and a director and a very concerned citizen. And I am honored on this Earth Day to be moderating a really interesting conversation with two extraordinary Americans. First, I want to introduce Alex Honnold, who is a climate activist and one of the world's greatest rock climbers. If you're anything like me, you spent about 2 hours with your heart in your mouth watching Alex free climb El Capitan in the Oscar-winning documentary Free Solo. Alex is also the founder of the Honnold Foundation, which supports initiatives that bring solar energy to disadvantaged communities around the world, tackling both climate change and inequality together. So thanks so much, Alex, for joining us. Also with us is a man who was part of the very first Earth Day ever in 1970, and ever since then has been one of the leading voices in the environmental movement. And Secretary John Kerry was, as you all know, Secretary of State under President Obama. And John is also the co-founder of World War Zero, which is a coalition of unlikely allies who are committed to addressing the issue of climate change. It comprises scientists, CEOs, military leaders, activists, artists, and so many others from all walks of life and all sides of the political spectrum to come together and who have launched this incredible effort. And I feel very lucky to be one of the original enlistees of World War Zero. So thank you both for joining. And I kind of wanted to point out, to get us started, here we are in the middle of this pandemic, which will, unquestionably alter the fabric of 21st century society in the same way that the Great Depression and both world wars altered the fabric of the 20th century. And we're kind of looking at two outcomes here, and maybe both, I don't know, but I really want to hear your perspectives. On one hand, this terrible event that the world is living through right now could galvanize the human race and serve as a kind of wake-up call that what we're experiencing now is just a dress rehearsal for what could be a far more catastrophic climate change event. And the thought of having seen what the human race is capable of when we put our minds to it, this could have a real silver lining. On the other hand, true to human nature, it's also undeniable that the economic pressures of this current crisis are going to raise a lot of voices that, as soon as we find our way out, are going to be, insisting on us going back to business as usual, except this time on steroids in terms of the impact on the environment. And maybe we can start with Secretary Kerry. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the relationship between COVID-19 and the climate crisis, the larger climate crisis, and talk a bit about what World War Zero is doing to address these.
Well, Tony, thank you. First of all, thank you very, very much for your own activism and for taking time. A lot of celebrities they sort of shy away sometimes from putting themselves on the line for one issue or another. So I have great respect for the fact you're here tonight and you signed up early right away. It means a lot. And Alex, so much courage, so much daring, so extraordinary in the discipline you've been able to demonstrate in an extraordinary skill. And everybody who knows of you or has seen you perform is in awe of you. And it's great to have your voice here tonight to be part of this discussion, because not many people get as close to the basics of the relationship between us and Mother Earth as you do. For your question, Tony, let me just say that a lot of people are worried about whether there is a connection or no connection between COVID and climate, and there are connections. They're very, very clear connections. That is not to say that climate change created the particular event or virus that came out of Wuhan. No one's suggesting that, I think. What we are saying, however, is that it is a scientific fact. It is known in the medical and in the scientific community that studies climate that pandemics thrive on the increased warmth, on the changes in the patterns of our weather, and animals move. There's a whole migration that takes place among animals, and that has a cause in terms of the spreading of viruses or diseases, whatever, as a result of that. In addition to that, we know that there are preconditions that people suffer from. Many of the people who've died because of those preconditions, and many of those preconditions are enormously agitated and more complicated as a consequence of climate change. The fact that climate change is pollution, folks. It is the pollution of carbon, of sulfur, of methane, other nitrous oxide. These are the gases that go up into the atmosphere and they just lodge there, and they contain the warmth around the planet, and the planet has been steadily rising as a consequence of that. Last January was the hottest January in history, human history. The one day in January was the hottest day in human history. That 1 year and day were part of the hottest decade in human history. And the decade before that was the second hottest, and the decade before that was the third hottest. So the trend and the scientific input on this is absolutely clear. And the other most important linkage of COVID-19 and of climate is the absolute similarity of the deniers calling climate change a Chinese hoax and calling the coronavirus a Democrat hoax. And people who have decided to put their heads in the sand and not have a conversation, not try to focus in on what the science really is or what the facts are or what the evidence is. And so we heard that the coronavirus would disappear in a matter of weeks, that very few people were touched by it, that it wasn't really going to be a problem. And it literally was called a hoax. And 2 months went by when we did not respond. That is a microcosm of what has been happening with climate for the last 20 or 30, 40 years. People denying it, calling it a hoax, avoiding the evidence. And even though it's over the horizon, as coronavirus was last December, it's coming at us. Now we're consumed by the chaos of the inadequacy of our response to coronavirus, and we will be overwhelmed by the chaos of the lack of our adequate response to climate change, which the scientists have told us we have 9 years left from a 12-year warning they gave us to be able to make the key decisions that will prevent the worst things, the greatest catastrophes that come with this climate crisis. So that's our charge. That's our responsibility. And World War Zero is an effort to bring voices together that wouldn't ordinarily talk to each other. We have business people, artists, actors, directors. We have clerics, reverends, pastors, people of faith. We have former military leaders. We have business leaders. For example, we have General Stan McChrystal, who was the leader of our special forces, the man who put together the plans and executed them to go after Osama bin Laden. We have an admiral who was in charge of all the policy and planning at the Pentagon, Admiral Lee Gunn. And we also have former Republican secretaries of defense like Bill Cohen and Chuck Hagel, also senators. And we have former governors like Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and Christy Todd Whitman, governor of New Jersey. Everyone has come together for a simple reason. We don't have time to waste. We cannot allow the conversation to be one where young people in our country are desperate to get adults to behave like adults, and where the adults are just, refusing to act. So we have to have conversations with each other. And World War Zero, as Tony said in his introduction, brings unlikely allies together: Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, right, left, people of faith, pastors, business, etc. And we want to have a conversation with everyone in America that is open-minded and ready to listen. Now, we know that 90% of Americans say they're prepared to have a conversation on climate. So we want to have those conversations. That's what World War Zero is about. The zero is the goal of getting to zero net negative emissions, net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner if we can. And World War is the fact that it cannot be done without the entire planet, all countries coming together and working together. Now, we have created, I'm proud to announce tonight, this is the first time I've talked about it, World War Zero has put together a new app, which we are introducing tonight, will be available. And all you have to do is go to the new app will help people to have a tool to be able to have the conversations I just talked about. It will allow you to post direct to media accounts. It will allow you to take content from World War Zero and put it out there. It will allow you to connect with people in your community. So it's a very useful tool. All you have to do is go to worldwarzero.com/organize. worldwarzero.com/organize. And you'll have access to that app. So, Tony, thanks again. Very much. We look forward to a good conversation tonight.
Yes, thank you. And that's an incredible thing. That's really exciting about that tool. You know, 'cause so many people want to learn how they can engage and how exactly to do it. That just sounds brilliant. I wanted to draft for a second off of something you mentioned, Secretary Kerry, about climate deniers and the forces against this movement. And Alex, you, in addition to being an extraordinary, athlete and climber, you use your platform as a world famous climber to speak out on climate issues, and it's the purpose of your foundation. And I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about how you view, as a high profile activist, and how you think other high profile activists can talk to climate deniers, and also maybe not deniers, but people who just literally don't appreciate how severe this crisis is.
So there's a lot to unpack there. And actually, I'd like to maybe start by just saying something in response to COVID, because, that's kind of what you started with Secretary Kerry. I think that another side of the COVID response, something that I actually find sort of heartening, is that I think for somebody my age, it's the first time in my lifetime that I've actually seen the global community act together in a way, or at least maybe not even the global community, but just to see the whole country act on an issue and actually make drastic change quickly. And I think that I've grown up in a time that I've watched climate science be ignored for my entire lifetime. And everyone says it's impossible, it'd be too hard to change, it's too much. And yet in the last month and a half, I've seen the entire country fundamentally change. And so for somebody like me, it's actually in some ways heartening to see that such change is possible when we set our minds to it. And so when I apply that to climate change and climate crisis, I see that, there are possibilities there when there's the will to act. And I think that, so far there's been a lack of will in this country, and hard to know if this will, hard to know if the country will act on this or not. But at least now we know that it's possible, that we could.
Yeah, and we really have to. I mean, because it's so often, I heard in the previous conversation, Secretary Kerry, Governor Kasich, who's part of your coalition, saying that the American people, we tend to sort of not look further than the present or the immediate, circumstance. And I think I'm really prayerful that what you said, Alex, is true. And I know, young people are the ones, your generation and younger even. My kids, I have two millennial girls in their 20s, and this is really they view it as an existential issue. But before we continue, I wanted to, yes, please, Secretary. Yes, please.
Quickly to what Alex just said, because he made a critical point at the end when he said, there's just not the will. That's what this is all about. That's really the key. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day today. And as you mentioned in your intro, I first became involved in Earth Day when I came back from the war in Vietnam. And we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on one single day. people who didn't want to live in cities where they couldn't, Los Angeles, New York, you couldn't see across the city. And they were worried about living next to a toxic waste site or a dump or so forth. So bottom line, inspired by Rachel Carson, an incredible woman who wrote Silent Spring in 1962, that generation sort of grabbed the reins and everybody came out. It was a stunning success, but they didn't stop there. They translated it into a political movement that looked at the Congress and said, well, here are the 12 worst votes. They called them the Dirty Dozen, and they defeated 7 of the 12 in the next election. That's exactly what lit the fire that created an unbelievable amount of legislation. The Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, all came out of this activism. So, when Alex says the will isn't there, he's absolutely correct. We got deniers in the Congress, but they are there with impunity. Take away the impunity, which you can do with this thing called the vote, and all of a sudden you've won the future back. It's really that basic.
Yeah. No, it's so true. That's why we have the current occupants in the White House, really. That's really true, and I'm hopeful. I really am optimistic. We got over 1,000 questions online from people for you guys, and so we'd like to just take a minute to take a couple of those. And just so people know, we're going to take some of these pre-sent questions, but you can submit questions online, and in a little bit we'll try and answer as many questions as we can from a live Q&A with you all. But here are a few that came in, as I said, of over 1,000 questions. The first one was submitted by Jonathan in New York City, and Jonathan asks, it took the massive war effort of World War II to get us out of the Great Depression. Do you think that a similar effort, this time battling climate change, would be advisable and or feasible for a potential Biden administration? And what would your roadmap be? Do either of you want to take that? Sounds maybe Secretary.
Well, I think thank you for the question. And you could be a good policy advisor to the current administration. The fact is that this is the moment. This is absolutely the moment. If oil is down to $20 a barrel, net negative the last few days, but the futures I think are somewhere around 28 or something like that dollars a barrel. The point is that that could hurt people's automatic movement to electric or alternative and renewable energy. So this is the moment where Congress and the president have to make a fundamental decision for the nation and ask the nation to do what Roosevelt asked the nation to do, which is come together in an unprecedented way to define the future. We need to move rapidly towards renewable, sustainable energy. We need to wean ourselves from fossil fuel, as the marketplace has already been doing to some degree, but we need to accelerate it. Why? Because not one country in the world is yet meeting what the Paris Agreement set out, and the Paris Agreement does not get done what we need to do to hold the Earth's temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. So we are facing an existential moment. It cannot be described as anything less than that. The Greenland ice sheet is now melting 4 times faster than it was 10 years ago. If it melts in its entirety, which it will if we go over 2 degrees, and right now we're plowing over 2 degrees, if it melts entirely, we'll have 9 meters of sea level rise. That's 25 or so feet. On the East Coast and other places, that's just utterly disastrous. So it's imperative that we invest in the infrastructure and in the initiatives that will move us to electric transportation, to decarbonized creation of the power that provides our electricity, heats our homes, et cetera, drives many trains and trolleys and so forth. We need to retrofit many buildings, which are huge emitters of emissions. We need to find a way to excite greater, faster development of alternative renewable, maybe even hydrogen fuel, other things, that could come significantly through the pricing of carbon, which conservative, Republican former secretaries of Treasury and State, George Shultz and Jim Baker, are suggesting is a policy Republicans should support, which is a marketplace where you're pricing carbon, which reflects the price we're going to pay to clean up and do what we need to do to make this transition. Bottom line, this is an enormously upside, positive economic future for all of us. If we are dominant in certain technologies, if we're selling them to the world, if we ourselves have a marketplace of energy users that is using sustainable and renewable energy, our health will be better. And there are significant statistics to document that. Our economy will be stronger, more jobs, better jobs, well-paying, great amount of wealth created. And finally, our security will be better. We won't have to send young men and women in uniform to some far-off place to defend America's source of energy. So this is the moment, and I think your question is right on point.
Yeah, that's so well put, and it was really a great question. The next one I'd love to have you take a shot at, Alex. So this is from Kirby in Egremont, Massachusetts, and Kirby asks, how can we implement better practices in our education system so that the younger generation understands the impact of climate change?
I mean, I would say the first step is just teaching basic science, which is something that the current administration could maybe work on as well. I mean, to some extent, there's been a clear scientific consensus on climate change for 30 years. And so I think that if people are learning basic chemistry and physics and biology, it's like, that's a good first step. I don't know. Something I've been thinking about, though, while Secretary Kerry's been speaking, is a little bit. I mean, most of the things that you're saying, Secretary, are such broad, big policy, governmental action. And while I think that is probably the way to have the biggest impact on climate, I mean, that fundamentally policy changes are what has to happen to decarbonize the world. But I think that in some ways that's alienating to individuals, because I think that for somebody just sitting at home listening to it, it feels too big that way. And a big part of why I started my foundation was because I went on sort of a personal quest of what can I do as an individual to have some kind of positive influence or positive impact in the world. And so I started researching carbon offsets. I started looking at other ways to offset my travel or just reduce my own emissions. I went vegetarian, basically tried to do the things that an individual can do. But ultimately, that all sort of came up short. I changed my banking, things like that. I mean, there are a lot of sort of subtle things that you can do as an individual that you can sort of opt out of this, system that is behind climate change. But when you get past all those kind of simple steps, you're left with what do you do now? And so that was kind of why I started the foundation and started focusing on energy access in a certain way. But I think that it's kind of important to pursue both paths, like the big policy, implementing a carbon dividend, things like that, implementing a carbon price. I mean, that's the way that you can change society. But I think that individuals also need to have some path forward for themselves. We're like, well, what can I do that's actually useful? And so, I don't know. I mean, it's important to talk about both.
Alex, you're right on target. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm delighted you're saying it, because you have great impact with a lot of folks in saying that, and it's important for people to make their personal choices. I think I was trying to point out, in answer to that question, sort of what is it going to take to really know that we're on a track to hit 2 degrees, to hold on to 2 degrees. And frankly, if we don't decarbonize the source of power, and if we don't decarbonize our transportation and so forth, we're not going to make it. I mean, that's why I put those out there. But the way you're going to have the greatest impact in these conversations that we're talking about having, and that you would have with people, is in fact to show people how individually, because the inclination when you hear what I just said, I know, is sort of pull the covers up over your head, and just hibernate and say, I can't do that. This is out of my control. And the fact is, it is also going to take an enormous commitment by individual citizens who begin to say, well, what can I do? Now, World War Zero is I think we're thoughtful about this, and I think we're sensitive to it. And if you go to the worldwarzero.com website, we tee up a menu of things that you can choose to do. We lay down the menu, and it could be anything. It could be anything for anybody who's in grade school to middle school, high school, college, whatever. You can be involved in your community, talk to your parents, influence your parents about what kind of car they're going to buy, or whether or not how the house is set up to be able to be energy efficient. What kind of what do you eat, and where was it produced, and how was it produced? There are just a lot of questions and ways in which people can contribute. And we lay out personal individual choices, local community choices you could make, then choices within your state, and then finally, sort of the more macro, the bigger things you can do in terms of electing a president and having a Congress that does things. But Alex, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, may I jump in? So I actually read through the whole list on the World War Zero website, and in classic Braun was like, oh yeah, this is a good list. I basically have personally implemented almost every step down the list, and I was like, oh, it was exactly the journey that I've gone on as an individual. And so it's funny because even though I'm sort of like, oh, well, what can individuals do? I've actually recently sort of started to think that the putting the onus on individuals is something that corporations kind of dump onto individuals in order to relieve themselves of the burden. Basically by saying like, oh, well, you should give up eating meat. That's a way for meat producers to not have to worry about their emissions and, pollution and production, all that. Basically,
sure.
It's just such an interesting, like, well, individuals can definitely have an impact, but you don't really want to put the whole weight of it onto individuals, because ultimately, if the system, if policy isn't in place, no amount of individual action is going to have that big, so it's a weird give and take. But
it really is a partnership, isn't it? It really, the way our democracy and the fundamental change happens is a partnership between individuals taking responsibility. And the first one you mentioned, Secretary Kerry, of course, which is so important, is the vote. But what you described of your path, Alex, is, I think, so inspiring. I remember both of my daughters, who are in their 20s, coming to me. My older one is now very much an activist, but my younger one is asking me the same questions of like, I have so much desire to have an impact, and I feel a tremendous responsibility to have an impact, but I have no platform because I have no money. I'm 20 whatever years old, and what can I do? And so, the toolkit that you laid out, Secretary Kerry, that people can find on the website, or the example you sort of looking inward to yourself, Alex, which changed your own lifestyle or impacted your own lifestyle, but then also inspired you to create this foundation, which is bringing solar energy to to disadvantaged communities and rural communities, and it can grow. And that's I really urge people who are watching to go check out these lists and put your own plan together. And yes, you must vote, you must engage, but with that energy, I always feel like, speak your dreams aloud and the angels will hear you. You have to, as an individual, get active, and it stems into communities. I mean, even like in my community, finally, they banned plastic bags at the grocery store. Well, until the town banned plastic bags, people just used them, and then it recently happened in New York City as well. As soon as the government said, okay, this is the new rule, everyone was thrilled to do it. So it's back and forth, but I remember working in Germany 10 years ago, and the fact of using a plastic bag in Germany 10 years ago they thought we were insane, So, I'm sorry, did anyone want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, may I just say that, maybe the real strength in personal actions is the way it empowers you to continue. I think that the real value in taking those personal steps of, say, reducing meat or changing your transportation options, or, basically by taking some agency and making personal changes like that, I think that it empowers you to be a greater advocate for the environment and to care more about policy issues, to actually go out and vote. I guess really that's been the strength for me, is by going down this rabbit hole, taking all these personal steps. It's made me realize that I can at least affect. Well, actually, I guess it's made me realize what I can change, and then the limits of that. Like where policy has to step in, and so it gives you a much.
It's a great point, and I really appreciate your making it. It forces me to sort of. We'll have to go back and kind of evaluate that, but help me in that process. Would you add or subtract any of the things that are suggested that are there right now? And would you try to engage people in a different way?
No, yeah, it's interesting because so I think that for somebody like me who's gone down this path for the last 10 years, let's say, I mean, when I first started, or just for anybody watching, I went down a very clear path. I'm a professional rock climber. I spend all my time outside. I started reading a lot of environmental nonfiction and started worrying more about climate change, worrying about, basically as I grew older and started to care more about the outside world, I was like, oh no, what do I do? And so my path started very, very simply, where I realized that diet has a profound implication on climate. And so I started trying to reduce meat, things like that. And I started taking all these simple first personal steps. And then, so now 10 years down that path, I look at a list that World War Zero lays out and I'm like, oh, this is so simple. It's just like putting these little things onto, but actually that's a great list for somebody who's coming at it fresh, and I think that so many people haven't started down this path at all, basically like think that climate change is a hoax or think that it doesn't really matter or think that they can't make any difference. And so I think that it's important to engage people where they are and sort of start them on the path wherever is appropriate. And, I sort of remember what it was like to know nothing about the environment and care nothing about climate. It wasn't that long ago that I didn't know anything about it. And so, I think it is important to make those kinds of personal actions accessible at the beginning, but for them to lead to a point that leads to greater societal change. I mean, eventually you need policy change.
Was there one moment where you suddenly said, the light bulb went on, or was this just a process? And what first drew your attention to it?
No, for me, it was a long process. I read, there were a bunch of steps along the way. I remember one small step. My sister gave me this book called, it was the Conscious Something Shopping Guide. It was basically a small little shopping guide that gave you a ranking of brands to help you make sure that you were purchasing items that were in line with your values. And she signed the book for me, for Alex, in case you ever start giving a shit. And I was like, oh, that's nice. And with that book, I actually remember though, because it was sort of eye-opening for me that, I could go to the grocery store and there are two items on the shelf. They both cost the exact same, except that one is totally in line with my values and the other is exploiting workers and desecrating the environment. And I was like, oh, I should always be at least trying to make the good choice. And that sort of opened my eyes to energy choices and all other aspects of life where it's like, well, you may as well be making the good choice whenever you can.
How old were you when you went to, I'm sorry. What's that, Secretary?
Because we had 1,000 questions, I suddenly got worried that we're not.
We do have 1,000 questions. I was just curious to ask you, Alex, how old were you when you read that book and started that journey?
I think I was early 20s, and then and then the journey sort of continued. I mean, the foundation really came out because I looked into carbon offsets quite a bit and wasn't totally sure, and then I felt like I should just be supporting projects. Because carbon offsets work in various ways and they all wind up supporting specific projects. And I was like, well, I may as well support the projects that I think are the best directly, because then you know exactly what your money is going to, and you know that it's the right kind of project. And so then, that led to the Honnold Foundation, basically.
That's incredibly inspiring. For all of us, really, just that everyone can engage and go on that journey if you just start raising your consciousness and asking questions. And speaking of questions, so we do have a lot of questions, and a lot of you have now submitted live questions for us, which we're excited to take. So thank you for that. And I think we still have time to submit more. But before we get into those, we're just going to take a quick break, and we're going to show you a little video about how one classroom in Rhode Island is celebrating Earth Day. So we'll be right back.
There's nothing like a common cause to bring people together. It always has. In our country, that's who we are. That's where we come from. We come from the common cause of fighting for independence, fighting for our values through World War I, World War II. Now we have the greatest reason we've ever had, folks, to come together. And we won't get it done if we don't come together, because there's a shared responsibility between nations in achieving this. So I think it actually could be something that unites the world. There are 2 billion people 15 years old to 25 in the world. And there's 1.8 billion children 15 years old and younger. 400 million of them won't ever go to school. There are places of abject poverty still. There are a billion people who don't have electricity still. You talk about a task that would unite the world and bring people together in common cause. This is it.
To our Earth Day town hall, virtual town hall with Secretary Kerry and Alex Honnold. We've gotten some questions that you've submitted live, so I want to get into those because they're really some great questions. So the first question is was posed by Chris from YouTube, and Chris says, "Hi Tony, Alex, and John. How important are electric cars in fighting climate change? I think your collective endorsement may help me convince my family to get a Tesla." So, do either of you want to field that one?
Well, Tesla is a great car, and there are a whole new generation of electric cars coming online. All the dealers are now, makers are trying to get into it. Ford, before coronavirus, Ford was about to move with a big new plant in Detroit and so forth. I think it is really critical to get to electric. We need to have electric vehicles, but we also have to be mindful, as we do, that a lot of the materials that go into some of these, into batteries and into these vehicles, are not being created and collected and transformed from raw minerals and so forth in the best of practices. So we also have to be careful that we're not just rampantly creating a carbonized cost of the production of the electric vehicle. Same thing with some of the fuels like hydrogen and other things. But the bottom line is fuel cell technology is extraordinary now. The next generation of cars coming out this next year, I'm told Tesla will have a upwards of 400 plus mile range for a car. Most people in America living in cities or near cities or suburbs never drive the kind of range that an electric car has, but they still drive around in an internal combustion engine cars. It doesn't make sense. I'll just tell you personally, I'm going to get a Tesla, and I'm driving my last lease right now on a internal combustion engine car. And when you drive these cars, they're incredible. I mean, some people say, well, I like the zip of a really great car. Well, I got news for you. There are electric cars that go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, 2.6 seconds. I mean, you got to hold back. It's like a rocket ship. So people are going to find that they're going to scratch their heads and say, why didn't I do this sooner?
Secretary Kerry, I just got my first electric car. I got a Tesla. And they're affordable now, for relatively affordable. And I could not, I don't know how, I felt like I jumped 50 years into the future in terms of design and performance. And there's just no comparison, to even the most high performance cars. So anyway, here, wait, one other question for Al. I'm sorry, did you want to jump in, Alex?
Actually, may I add something? So I'm actually sponsored by a company called Rivian, which is an electric truck manufacturer. Yep. And they're, we'll be launching an electric pickup truck this year. Incredible car. But they also have been supporting a project that my foundation is working on in Puerto Rico for the island's first basically solar microgrid, sort of cooperative solar microgrid. And I think that the interesting point there is that, battery technology, so there are 2 points I want to make. One, that electric vehicles have lower life cycle emissions than internal combustion cars. So, I mean, in general, if you're looking for the environmental thing, it's probably, if you have to buy a new vehicle, you may as well go electric for sure, because overall it has a lower impact on the environment. That said, it still has an impact. I mean, you're still manufacturing a gigantic piece of machinery, and that does have an impact. And so I think that long term, not every individual in the whole world can buy an electric car. I mean, that's just too much manufacturing. That's too much. And so, getting around by bicycle, getting around by foot, getting around by public transit, like there's still places for other types of transit. But if you're buying an automobile, it should be electric. And then that said, that produces a ton of batteries. And I think that it's almost like a demonstration project that we're doing in Puerto Rico. I mean, it's 17 businesses, might be scaled up to sort of 50 businesses in this town square of Atuntas in Puerto Rico. But it will be a really good, I guess, demonstration project for what can be used for second life batteries from electric vehicles. I think that, we really need to expand our vision a little bit into what the energy grid of the future will look like, because when every car is also a storage device, and the old, engines of cars, basically the old batteries, can be used as stationary grid-tied storage or storage for your home, it really changes the way energy is used. And that helps balance out renewable energy, because obviously the big challenge of renewable energy is that it's intermittent. When the sun sets, you're no longer generating energy. So anyway, that's just my bit of a rant.
Right. And he's absolutely correct about that. I just saw an announcement today that in Italy, when they get out of this lockdown, they're going to limit the numbers of cars in that particular region. They're going to start building major bicycle paths, et cetera. People are starting to think a little differently as a result of this. But also, I think that well, let me just end there and we'll come back to the other, because I want to get some questions soon.
All right, good. Yeah, here's another question I was going to give to Alex from Marie M. from Facebook Live. As a teenage climate activist, I find it difficult to actually get out and do what I need to do. What kind of support can well, maybe this is actually for Secretary Kerry, I'm not sure. What kind of support can I give to World War Zero that isn't money?
Well, I just announced tonight the app that we are introducing. So go to worldwarzero.com/organize, and you will have an option, an app in front of you, which I personally navigated earlier today. And as you navigate through it, you have all kinds of options for being able to have a conversation with someone in your community, being able to connect to people, other people, being able to post information, different things you might be doing, getting people involved in a group to do a project. So there are all kinds of ways of engaging from your home digitally. Many of the conversations, most of them actually, the vast majority of conversations we are going to have now, between now and this particular election, are going to be digital. And so we're going to be talking with people through Facebook, through Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, whatever. We're going for broke to try to reach people. And you, as a young activist, boy, you really, I know you have a fantastic group of friends and people you're friended and you're talking to regularly, and, bring them all in, talk to them, get them all involved, have that be your first conversation.
Yeah, Alex, do you want to comment on that? Because it feels very connected to what you said about your own kind of introspective journey about how you could contribute. Because I think, what Marie said is very common amongst not only teenagers, but people in their 20s and, who don't feel that they have a platform or a checkbook, frankly, to be activists. And that's not the only way to begin.
Yeah, so I've thought about that a fair amount, because a lot of people reach out asking how they can help the Hanno Foundation without donating money, because some people want to help, but they don't have funds. And the reality is that we don't have that much opportunity for volunteering, like depending on where projects are. People can't just show up and help. And so I always sort of encourage people to basically start down that path of personal actions that we were talking about earlier. If somebody wants to do something useful, they should channel that energy towards which personal actions will have the greatest impact on climate. That could be encouraging their university to divest from fossil fuels. That could be changing their diet, changing their personal transportation options. But I think that maybe one of the important things for personal advocacy like that is to find the thing that they're personally inspired by. Because I think that a lot of actions, some actions are easier than others, and for each individual, there's some things that they just care about more. And so I think that you may as well start with the easy ones and then work your way towards the really hard ones. So in my case, limiting travel is hard, because as a professional climber, I climb on mountains all over the world. And so it's hard for me to limit flights, but I can sort of offset those flights in various ways by advocating by actually physically building renewable energy projects, which basically reduces carbon. I mean, those are all sort of simple math questions where you can see like, well, how much am I emitting? How much am I offsetting? And just make sure that you're having a positive impact. I don't know. I just think people should start on these things and work their way up.
That's great. So Alex, another one for you from Paul from Twitter. And Paul asks, Alex, you work outdoors more than anyone. Have you seen major change in the environment where you climb?
Yeah. I don't even know where to start. This February, I was in Patagonia, which is a region in southern Argentina, climbing in the Fitzroy Massif. Actually, I think so. I'm speaking from my kitchen. I think you can see some of the mountains on the wall behind me, actually. Or let's see, I'll pan this up. Yeah. So that's Fitzroy up behind in the top, the black and white. But so I was climbing those peaks, and I've now done 4 expeditions down to southern Argentina climbing, and just over those 4 years, I've seen glaciers retreat quite a bit, and to the extent that now the approaches that you take into the mountains, the way that you hike in to climb, has varied. Like, you used to walk on the south side of the lake, now you walk on the north side of the lake because the lake has extended so much as the glacier retreats. Things like that, and I think that. I've always felt personally that people who deny climate change in the U.S., I feel like part of that is just from a lack of travel or a lack of personal experience going to bigger mountains, seeing the way the world changes, because I'm not even that old and I've personally seen quite a bit of change in this world. And, even in my home mountain range of the Sierra Nevada in California, I've seen the mountains change over my lifetime. And I'm just like, it's hard to deny that. You can see it with your own eyes.
Yeah. Secretary Kerry, would you want to comment on, this thing of how to approach, climate deniers? We have another question which actually relates to this, and this is from Ms. Cece 2007 from YouTube. What is the psychological drive behind the dramatic polarization in politics and hence policies, and what can be done to understand the extremists and science deniers and bring them closer?
Well, I think, it's a really excellent question. It's also a very complicated question because there's a certain amount of psychology in it and other, political science, other pieces to it. Some people, let me begin here. A whole bunch of folks on the political right and on the political left, and maybe a lot in the center nowadays, are really pretty angry at government. And people are pretty disappointed. And they're also, many people are just upset with their own lives. Life has gotten a lot harder in the last years because globalization has not been friendly to certain parts of the economy or to certain people. And unfortunately, I regret this enormously, I don't want to be political tonight, but an enormous amount of the benefits of globalization have gone to a tiny, tiny percentage of citizens. The wealth inequities in our country are driving people into a place where they feel like they're losing their country, they're losing their life. And the result is they're defensive. People get really angry. And so, along comes somebody who's kind of putting you under siege for your, quote, not thinking or thinking. And man, that's a way to drive somebody away. You just can't have a conversation like that. So you can't have this in the mainstream of our abusive, exploitative political structure right now. I regret to say that you just get chewed up and spit out by people who are much more Machiavellian and cynical, and they're going to just drive a wedge. And that's what's been happening. That's what's happening right now to some degree. The key is to have these personal conversations. Go see your grandparents, your parents, or talk with friends, and be polite and be extremely respectful. And I'd say to somebody, look, I don't want to attack your point of view. I'm not here to do that. But the last time I looked at something, 2 and 2 is 4, not 5. And I think we're trying to figure out the following and draw them into the conversation. 90% of Americans, according to polling data, say they're ready to have that kind of a conversation, but it has to be a real conversation, not a diatribe, not an assault. And I think that's the most important thing people need to remember going into this. There's no superiority. The fact that you may have come to a conclusion sooner doesn't make somebody else less intelligent or less committed. You've got to be respectful. And if we can get respect back into our dialogue in our country, I think we can work wonders. I think people are prepared to try to respond in a thoughtful way, but not in a hardcore, I'm better than you, why didn't you figure this out years ago, Blum. That's a way to just make somebody harden down and hate you at the same time.
What about you, Alex? I'm curious because you've devoted so much of your time now to this issue. Do you find yourself having to have those conversations with people kind of on the other side of this issue?
Yeah, I actually really enjoy talking to people on the other side, and I consider myself kind of good at it. Actually, I really enjoy it, and I think that fundamentally you just have to start from a place of good intentions, like assume the best of people. And for me, I look at all humans are roughly the same. We're all the same kind of animals. We all care about our communities, we care about our families, we care about our basic needs, but fundamentally we all want the same things. We want to lead a peaceful, comfortable, healthy life. And so, it's pretty easy to connect on certain basic issues like that, where it's like, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, most people want to see the world exist into the future. They want their kids to continue to live on a world similar to the world that they grew up in. And sort of by definition, conservation is a conservative issue. If you're on the far right, like, you should care about conservation. You should care about the environment. That should be a foundational part of the platform. It's the same word.
It used to be a core part of the Republican Party.
Well, exactly. And the thing is, I think that the individuals, the people who are voting for the Republican Party, probably still care about it in a very similar way. Most people want to see the world protected. On the issue of public lands in the U.S., there's wide bipartisan support for public lands. Like, people like going into nature. They like knowing that our natural wonders are protected. Basically everyone in the U.S. loves Yosemite National Park. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. And, there's wide support for that. And so I think when you appeal to that as an individual to a person, you're like, look, do you care about these things? People do care. I think that, it's important just to connect with people how you can.
That's
Can I just add very quickly?
Please.
Talk the upside. Show, don't just talk the doom, here's what's coming out. Show people how you can have less lung disease. Show people how kids get hospitalized in the summer in America. We spend $55 billion a year on that. We could save money and people would live a better life, be more productive. So I think there are huge, genuine, real upsides that you can lay out to people that make a huge difference to their thinking.
I think that's so true, both personally on a level that both of you have described, but it's also true economically. I think what's going to happen, the fossil fuel industry is dominant now because that's what's been happening. And, in the way that Elon Musk has with Tesla, by just punching through and proving that something is better, and when people start making money, that it's economically a positive. And for our personal economies as well. It's one thing on a giant corporate level, but on an economic level, in addition to on a moral and spiritual. I think what both of you said about reaching out and not making it about the other person being wrong is just is really a power. Empathy is a very powerful force. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our time, and this has been a really inspiring and fascinating conversation. And I want to thank Alex and Secretary Kerry for being here and allowing me to be a part of this. And thank you to everyone who is watching, because and I hope you're as inspired as I am, and I hope all of you will engage and get active in some of the ways that Alex and Secretary Kerry have laid out, because we need your activism and your voices now more than ever. We're in the middle of a very painful crisis right now, and we have to make sure that this galvanizes us into a better future, that the skies that are now clear around us can stay that way, and we see glimmers of that. So go to worldwarzero.com and join us now. So Thanks. I don't know, Alex or Secretary Kerry, do you want to have any closing thoughts?
Well, may I just say that I've really enjoyed chatting with you guys, and I'm sorry, can we just keep going? I'm like having such a nice time talking about this issue. You know, I'm just sitting in my kitchen. I'm free all day, but let's just go as long as you like. You know.
I don't know whether we can keep going. I don't know what the parameters are of our team here that's working with me. If they sent me a signal that said, "Hey, you can keep going for 10 minutes," I'll wait to see if I can read the banner on it and we can respond. But I do want to say to folks who have tuned into this, we can get this done. This is not out of reach yet, but the danger signs that it's moving faster, the negative parts of it are really, really scary. And we can manage them, but only if we start to come together and make the choices we need to make. I know that, for instance, and Alex has got to have seen this, but permafrost is now melting in places that were very cold, Alaska, Siberia, other places, and the tundra is melting. And the result is that methane, which is 20 times more damaging than carbon dioxide, is now being released for the first time in 40 or 50,000 years, whatever. And that's something that's really damaging to our capacity to win this battle. And there are other indicators like that. We spend $265 billion in the last, 2 years ago, we did that for 3 storms just to clean up after the storms, Maria, Harvey, and Irma. And so Irma had the first winds of 185 miles an hour sustained for 24 hours. Harvey dropped more water on Houston than in 5 days than goes over Niagara Falls in an entire year. I mean, just amazing phenomena happening. 500-year floods are happening more frequently now within a 5-year span. So the signals are clear, but there's a huge upside to our economy, to our jobs, to our health, to our security, if we move now to open up this better future. And I just hope people will go to worldwarzero.com and /organize, use this new app. It will really help you to engage on this topic. I think it'll give you a great sense of, wow, I'm really in this now, and I'm able to get some things done, and I can help make a difference. So, Alex, it's such a pleasure. I'm really very, very pleased and proud to be here with you, and I thank you, and I look forward. I hope you can continue to take part here and there where we have things that are happening, because it's going to take everybody on board to make it happen. And Tony, likewise, thank you so much for activism and being part of this.
Yeah, well, thank you, Secretary Kerry. And I just want to echo, as we close, one thing you just said about what it feels like to get active. Whether you're 50 years old or whether you're 16, the power of just beginning to engage in by voting, by getting in community, by going on to worldwarzero.com and starting to explore those questions for yourself, it creates momentum, and it's incredibly satisfying, and you will find out how you can have an impact and make a difference. So with that, we'll bring this to a close, and I just want to say to everybody, please stay safe and healthy, and for now, keep your social distance and wear your masks, and let's keep each other safe and healthy. And happy Earth Day, everyone.
Thank you.